Our culture has been upended by globalization, consumerism, neoliberal economics, and the primacy of individualism. The result of this immense upheaval are political polarization, a widening gap between groups, and societal fragmentation. And these transformations of our culture are not slowing down. So how does the church respond to the challenges that come with this socio-cultural transition? What kind of faithful leadership is needed in the midst of this changing context? We can name the changes created by this socio-cultural upheaval, but are we able to discern where God is at work in the midst of this? Or will we remain enclosed in technique and our own agency? I believe that as church leaders, what is needed in this time of massive socio-cultural change is a new imagination. We need an imagination that looks for God at work in the midst of this transition. An imagination where we start by noticing and discerning, and then reflect on what we are noticing and discerning, then experiment and explore what we are learning, only to reflect again and experiment again. This is not a linear method of learning. This is an ever looping and circling back butterfly path forward. The new imagination we seek will require learning new practices which change our habits. New habits change behavior. And more importantly, new habits change the way we live in the world. All of this will require time, energy, and fortitude, as well as a new way of leading. But first and foremost, this new imagination requires an honest dependence on God's agency to lead us into a new way of Christian living in the world, rather than us depending on ourselves, our human agency, to fix the church and to fix those that we are trying to serve. First Presbyterian Church, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, was organized in 1883, and it is a mainline denominational church which, like other traditional mainline churches, lives into an attractional, program-driven church model. This type of church model lends itself to an inward focus and the desire to fix ourselves. The congregation is generous with their time, talents, and especially their treasures inside the walls of the church, out in the community, and around the world. Our practice is generally to do things monetarily and or through physical donations and in big ways. FPC has a presence in the community and a Christian imagination that acknowledges that we are here to help. And this is comfortable and powerful place for FPC to reside because it's easy to give out of our excess, and it makes us feel good knowing that we can and do help others. The challenge is the congregation has a Christian social engagement that relies on us using our skills, resources, and willingness to meet a need. This way of engagement is not wrong, and in many cases, this is what is needed. But as we think about it, we notice that this type of engagement creates a disconnect between the congregation and the people we serve. It creates inequality. This kind of Christian social engagement turns people into projects, and mission becomes a program which directs the project. Human agency directs the action, and we create the kind of future we want to see. What this Christian vision is missing is seeing the people behind the need. What is missing are small-scale, profound relationships built on mutual understanding. What is missing is the broader understanding that God is at work in the world out ahead of us. And we are to discern what God is doing and then become involved in that work. we have grown unaware of God's presence in our ordinary movements and moments of our daily life together. The purpose of this doctoral project was to explore a different way of inhabiting the world and engaging God's people. I postulated that by introducing simple practices of noticing the ordinary, practicing presence, and dwelling in God's Word, it would be possible to lead a congregation from doing for others under our agency and move toward an engagement position of being with others as we discern God's presence among us. Now remember, engaging new practices develops new habits that change and transform behavior, which leads us into a different way of being in the world. My goal for this project was to lead a small cross-section of the congregation called a praxis team, to reimagine how we might be present in the community in ways where we are not in control, but rather when we learn to come alongside others as we discern where God is at work. Framed within the reflective discernment of practical theology, I invited 6 members of our congregation to join me on this journey of learning and practicing. After 3 years together and after requirements for this doctoral program have wrapped up, this group continues to meet. And I believe that the strength of our outcomes is a direct result of the length of time that we have been together. The process of learning and understanding new practices, engaging these practices in everyday life, coming together to share stories and discern God's presence in the experience, all takes time and patience. None of this could have happened had we not first developed trust between all of us. A deep level of trust was developed as the praxis team first decided to practice presence by becoming prayer partners with one another. Each praxis team member communicated with their prayer partner daily. They shared joys and challenges, struggles and simple daily happenings. And then they prayed for one another. This practice of being present continued for months and created deep trust and care for one another. This environment of trust and care for one another soon allowed our gatherings to become sacred space as we enjoyed a meal, worship, learning, and discernment. Because I was leaning into a new imagination right alongside the others, I had no formal plan or agenda to follow. This allowed the group the freedom to explore practices, to listen to and learn from one another. Stories were shared as a tool to aid in explanation. Curiosity led to probing questions. Christian love for each other guided us and pushed each other to stretch just a little bit more. And as a leader, I learned that saying, "I don't know," frees up a lot of space for the Spirit to move and lead. To help us focus on the ordinary, as a praxis team, we spent the first 3 months together exploring the practice of noticing the ordinary through close examination of our morning routine. This practice of noticing every aspect of our morning routine was to be our immersion into the ordinary as we began to pay attention to and journal all the small things we do from the time we wake up in the morning to the time we begin our day. As the praxis team began building habits of recognizing, appreciating, and dwelling in the ordinary, we shifted our practice from observing our own daily routine to becoming more attentive to people we encounter in our morning and throughout the day. Stories were shared as we practiced listening to one another. The praxis team members said that they noticed that they had much more awareness of God throughout the day, meeting and seeing others. And they became more present to how God is touching everything. Examining our morning routine allowed us to look more closely at the rhythms, rituals, and practices we give ourselves over to every day. These everyday habits and practices, they form us. They guide and aim us in certain directions without us even thinking about them, and they reveal and shape what we love and worship. Through dwelling in the Word, the Praxis team learned to listen to each other and listen to God, speaking through the ancient texts. The practice of dwelling in the Word began with our first Praxis team gathering and continued throughout the project. We dove deep into Philippians 2, 1 through 11, the Christ hymn, Luke 10, 1 through 11, and then Luke 10, 29 to 37, the sending of the 70, and who's your neighbor? Luke 24, 13 to 35, the walk to Emmaus. Acts 16, 6 to 15, with Paul's change of plans, and Matthew 15, 13 to 16, the salt and light teachings. From here, the Praxis team explored different modes of engaging others. They started with and spent a great deal of time understanding a host and guest relationship. These conversations guided the Praxis team into a fuller awareness of transactional relationships, which led into discernment around engaging others in a manner of mutuality. Between practices and conversations, the Praxis team came to realize that the notion of only doing for others had become uncomfortable for them. It wasn't enough. They had learned and experienced that engaging others has to be much more than just doing things for somebody. They began to imagine what an honest, open, grace-filled conversation might look like. Noticing and acknowledging the other person and receiving from them. They focused on the importance of listening deeply and giving their full attention without any preconceived notion of where the conversation would go or how it would end. The Praxis team was processing what they were learning and practicing, and their learning was shaping the first of 2 3-month-long experiments. The Praxis team settled into their first experiment, which provided them the opportunity to test the practices they were learning. Each of us would notice and pay attention to at least 4 conversations we would have in the neighborhood or with family. We would enter into conversations mindfully and faithfully and notice how the conversations unfolded as we practiced presence. We reflected on the questions, where is God in this person's life? And what is God doing in our community? If the conversation presented an opportunity for us to share our faith, did we step into that opportunity? Why or why not? Were we comfortable and confident while doing so, or did we sidestep the opportunity? We were to reflect and journal the experiences and our thoughts. The Praxis team began to tell the story of another reality. Through this experiment, they each began to explore another way of inhabiting the world and engaging God's people. As the Praxis team shared stories about what they were experiencing during their experiment, I noticed 2 threads that ran through each discovery: confidence and trust. The practices the Praxis team engaged, the habits formed, the community that was built, the conversations and listening to one another, the trust that arose within the Praxis community, these collective actions were formative to the confidence the Praxis team found doing this simple step of having a conversation with someone. The Praxis team started to believe new things about themselves. And this simple experiment reinforced these new beliefs. There was also a sense of trust that came along with the confidence. Confidence came from new habits that were formed through the practices engaged. Trust came alongside confidence as the praxis team members were able to give up a bit of their own control and trust that God was going to be present and God was going to be at work in the conversations. For the second 3-month experiment, the praxis team wanted to continue to explore the practices that they engaged, and they wanted to build on what they had learned. They were finding a sense of confidence within themselves, and they wanted more of that. And then the global coronavirus pandemic arrived, and the praxis team had to adjust to the new reality of separation and isolation. The praxis team continued to trust the practices, and they began letting the practices direct what came next. So what did we learn? Well, first of all, the reflection-action approach to learning was critical. Reflection alone, learning and discussion, soon becomes intellectualism and verbalism. Action without any thought or consideration or reflection becomes activism. We continue to act without considering the impact our actions are producing. The reflection-action method of transformative learning was easily accessible to the praxis team. Another key learning for the praxis team was the unexpected confidence in themselves that grew out of the practices engaged and the habits that were being formed. Intentional noticing was also a unique discovery to this group. But perhaps one of the most significant discoveries was the importance of the group itself. Their comments were heartfelt and sincere when they spoke about the value of the praxis community that had developed. There is a clear trust between the members of the praxis team, and in this safe, comfortable place, everyone grew. And as one praxis team member said, when you get to see people grow, that grabs a hold of you. Another said, this group reminds us of what we are to be about: deeper relationships, having conversations with others, regenerating experience, noticing God in the midst of it all. The praxis team had not just become a loving community, they were becoming a community of people who were learning to notice God and participate in God's healing mission in the world. So, what's next? I don't know. But I have learned that we are witnessing a new imagination bubbling up among God's people. What the praxis team and I have learned and practiced and experienced has been, for at least several years now, gently seeping out into the congregation. And this additional way of engaging God's people is already showing up in conversations and small groups, in outreach activities, in our common language, and in our life together. God is at work, fermenting this new imagination. And FPC has taken the first steps toward faithful participation. Thanks be to God. And thank you for listening to me.